The altitude at Cathara Station does something to the light. You notice it on the first morning, the way the sun comes in low and hard off the glacier shelf to the east, cutting through the observation windows at an angle that turns everything bronze and sharp. No softening, no haze, just the world exactly as it is, every edge present, nothing blurred. I remember thinking that was either a good sign or a bad one, and I hadn't decided which by the time the transport ramp sealed behind us and the cold got into my jacket and stayed there. I'd done 7 of these multi-species summits over the years, mostly in my second career after I stopped doing field work. The first career was medicine, 11 years as a combat medic with the Federated Auxiliary, 2 postings in active theaters, 1 very long tour on a station hospital that never got a name, only a designation. I was good at it. I wasn't young when I started, and I was less young when I finished. And what I took away from it besides the shoulder that predicts whether now was a habit of looking at people the way a mechanic looks at an engine. Not to judge, just to understand what's running and what isn't. Most people find that unnerving. In my experience, the people who find it most unnerving are the ones who most need someone to look. My second career was logistics and medical liaison for the Interspecies Survey Commission, which is a longer name for a simpler job. Make sure the biological needs of multi-species delegations get met without incident, file the paperwork, stay out of the way of the diplomats. I was, as my supervisor once said, competent in the manner of a good road surface. You don't notice it when it's working. The summit at Cathara was a standard 19-day survey review, 3 species present, 1 contested resource zone up for assessment, 3 senior delegations and their support staffs. I was there to make sure no one ate something their metabolism couldn't handle, and that the medical bay had supplies for 4 different physiologies. I was not there to make history. The Orvin delegation arrived on the second transport, the day after us, just before the plateau weather closed in for the afternoon. I was at the bay doors doing inventory when they came through. 12 of them in the layered gray-green travel robes their species favors for off-world transit, a formal cut, high collars, no ornamentation. Standard Orvin diplomatic dress. I'd escorted their delegations twice before, and I knew the visual vocabulary. The senior figures always walked second, letting the advanced staff enter first as a security posture so old it had become ceremony. I counted the entry order as they came through the doors. She came in 4th. I registered her the way I register everyone on first contact when I'm working. Height, build, any visible asymmetries, the way they carry weight on their feet, the quality of their breathing in a new atmosphere. She was medium height for an Orvin female, which put her shorter than most of the delegation. Sage green skin, pale by their standards, their palette runs from dark forest to nearly gray, and she sat at the lighter end. Hair cropped close, very dark with reddish undertones that caught the bronze morning light as she came through the door. She was looking at the floor when she entered, then looked up, and I got the eyes. Amber with horizontal pupils, wide set, the kind of eyes their species developed on open plains where peripheral threat assessment mattered more than depth. She moved quietly, good balance, and then she shifted the satchel strap on her shoulder and I saw her right hand. The tremor was fine and rhythmic, the kind that lives in the small muscles of the hand and forearm rather than the whole limb. I've seen it in humans' essential tremor, a dozen other causes, most of them manageable, none of them debilitating unless the culture you live in decides they are. I filed it the same way I file everything. Data, no verdict. I went back to my inventory. The advanced staff member who handed me the delegation manifest listed her as Saraval, S. Cultural Observer, Secondary. No rank marker. No species protocol designation, which would normally tell me whether she had any food sensitivities or atmospheric pressure requirements. I flagged the gap in the manifest and handed it back with a question mark in the margin. The advanced staffer, young, tight expression, the kind of tightness that means something is being maintained, took the manifest back, said the observer's requirements were standard and had been pre-filed, and moved on before I could ask a follow-up. I let it go. In my experience, gaps in manifests are either clerical or deliberate, and the only way to tell which is to watch. I spent the rest of arrival day watching, as I always do, because watching is how I know where the problems are before they become incidents. The Tharvan delegation settled in the West Wing, efficient and self-contained as their kind always are. The Pelosi observers spread across the common areas in the loose, social way that's hardwired into their biology, and that makes nervous diplomats uncomfortable. The Orvin took the East Corridor, posted their own security at the Hall Junction, and began the process of establishing the social geometry that would govern their 3 weeks at the station. Who sat where, who spoke first in which room, what the sight lines were in every shared space. She was not in the geometry. That was the first thing I understood clearly by the end of that first day. She was present in all the shared spaces. She attended the opening orientation session, sat through the resource zone briefings, appeared at the dinner that evening in the common hall. But the geometry of the Orvin delegation moved around her the way water moves around a stone, not unkindly, not with visible hostility, but without incorporating her. She was not introduced to the Tharvan senior attaché. She was not positioned at the table where the lead Orvin delegate, a tall and carefully formal figure named Va Sarath, sat with the survey commissioners. She ate at a small table near the observation windows with one junior attaché who seemed to have been assigned specifically to be near her, and who spent most of the meal looking at his food. She held her teacup with both hands to steady it. She looked out at the glacier shelf. She didn't look at anything else for long. I went to bed that night and thought about the manifest gap in the geometry and the way the advanced staffer had moved on before I could ask a follow-up. And I thought about the hands. And I thought, whatever is happening here is above my pay grade and is none of my business, and I will manage the medical logistics and stay out of the politics, and in 19 days I'll be back on the transport, and this will be someone else's file. I've said this to myself before. I said it on my second tour during the station hospital posting about 3 different situations that I eventually couldn't leave alone. The thing about being a medic is that the training doesn't have an off switch. You register what's there. You file it. You can tell yourself you're not going to act on it, and sometimes that's the right call. Sometimes the situation requires you to hold your lane and let it be someone else's problem. But the file stays open. The pattern recognition runs in the background. And eventually, if the wrong is clear enough, the question isn't whether to act but how. I knew, lying on the bunk in the station quarters with the wind working at the window seals and the glacier shelf, a pale line of cold out in the dark, that the situation in front of me was not one I was going to file and walk away from. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. But I knew I was going to do something, and that the something was going to be proportionate and careful, and that tomorrow I was going to pull the Orvin medical database entries and see what I should have pulled before we ever left the transport hub. On the second day, the resource negotiations began in earnest, and I spent most of it in the medical bay running calibration checks on the Tharvan-compatible atmospheric unit they'd shipped up on the cargo lifter. The Tharvan physiology runs on a slightly different oxygen-nitrogen mix than the station's default, and the margin for error in high-altitude environments is smaller than it looks on paper. I was there most of the morning. The Pelosi observer who'd been having minor pressure adjustment symptoms came in at midday, and I treated her, and she left in better shape. I ate my lunch at the bay desk and read the briefing materials I was supposed to have read on the transport. In the afternoon briefing, the one I attended as a medical representative, I sat along the back wall with the other support staff and watched the room. The survey commissioners presented their initial resource zone findings, the usual careful language, the usual diplomatic architecture. The senior Orvin delegate spoke twice, precise and unhurried. The Tharvan lead spoke once. The The Pelosi observers, who operate by consensus, passed a small carved token between their three representatives when they wanted to indicate agreement, which the Orvin delegation had not been briefed on, and which produced a moment of visible confusion that the commission chair smoothed over. She sat in the third row on the Orvin side, not the first row where Vassarath and the two senior attaches sat, not the second row where the secondary negotiators sat. The third row, against the side wall, at an angle where she could see the presentation screens but the main body of the room couldn't easily see her. When the commission chair introduced the delegation members at the opening of the session, she was not introduced. When the floor was open for questions, she did not speak. I watched her take notes in a small bound journal with careful, deliberate strokes, writing slowly, controlling the pen, making the tremor work around instead of through. I have sat with many people in the aftermath of injury and illness. I know what it looks like when a body has made its accommodations and gotten on with things. She had made her accommodations a long time ago. That evening I was in the common hall at the end of the service period, after most of the delegations had gone back to their quarters. I was doing a final check of the environmental monitor's standard end-of-day task, and I came around the corner near the observation window bank, and there she was, still at the small table, alone now. The junior attaché was gone. She had a cup of something and she was looking at the glacier shelf in the dark, which meant she was looking at her own reflection, because the observation glass doesn't transmit much at night. I don't know what she saw. I could have gone around. There was nothing I needed to check near that table. I pulled a chair from the nearest stack, set it at the opposite end of the table and sat down, not close, not beside her, just at the other end of the table in the same radius of the window's warmth. She looked at me. I didn't introduce myself. I just pulled out the schedule tablet I'd been carrying and looked at it because I actually did have something to check on it, and I checked it. After a moment she said, in quite good unified standard, "You're the medical liaison." I said I was. She said, "You were watching me during the briefing." I said that I watch everyone during briefings. Occupational habit. Medics are pattern readers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What pattern did you read?" I looked up from the tablet. She was watching me with those amber eyes, horizontal pupils, and there was something in her expression that was not quite a challenge and not quite a question, more like a test of a specific hypothesis she'd formed. I said, "That you've been writing by hand since long before this assignment, that you adapted your grip a long time ago, that the pen control is excellent." Her eyes didn't change, but something around them did, a very small adjustment in the muscles of her face that I filed as surprised and choosing not to show it. She said, "That is a precise observation." I said, "I was a field medic for 11 years. I notice hands." She looked down at the cup she was holding with both of hers. Then she looked back at me. "They told you I am a cultural observer," she said. I said they had. She said, "And you believe that?" I said I hadn't formed an opinion yet. Another silence. The glacier shelf was dark blue in the station's exterior lights, the ice-catching color it hadn't earned from the sun. She turned back to the window. I thought the conversation was done. Then she said quietly, still looking at the glass, "What does a field medic notice about hands?" I thought about how to answer that, not whether, how. She'd asked it in a particular register, not casual. She wanted the real answer. I said, "Fine rhythmic tremor in the intrinsic muscles of the hand and forearm. Present at rest, slightly worsened under fine motor demand. Not a degenerative pattern, the control too good for degeneration that old. Consistent with familial essential tremor or any of several related presentations. Common, manageable in most physiologies, not a verdict." She was very still while I said it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought I'd misjudged the moment, gone further than the conversation warranted. I started to say something about the environmental monitor and excuse myself. She said, "No one has used that word before." I asked which word. She said, "Manageable." I didn't say anything. She said, "The word my people use is voided." It means there is an idiom. The closest translation in Unified Standard is something like an instrument that cannot hold its tuning, a thing that cannot be relied on for precision. It is the word for someone who cannot rule. She said it flatly, the way you say a thing you've said to yourself so many times it has worn smooth. My mother's court argued about it for 2 years before I came of age. There was a faction that believed a physical condition inherited at birth was not a moral defect. They were a very small faction. I held the tablet in my lap and said nothing. The glacier shelf was out there in its blue cold. She said, "I have been empress for 6 years. My court knows this. The delegations here do not." Vasareth believed, correctly, that if the other species delegations knew they were negotiating with the sovereign rather than a cultural observer, the power dynamics of the summit would shift in ways that would not benefit the outcome. She paused. He is not wrong about that, and he is not wrong that I agreed to this arrangement. But there is a difference between agreeing to an arrangement and agreeing to disappear. I thought about that. Then I said, "How long has it been since someone in a room used your title?" She thought about it, really thought, not a rhetorical pause. She said, 11 months. The station hummed. Somewhere in the east corridor a door closed. I said, "My name is Corvin Osel. I'm going to look up the Orvin physiological literature on heritable tremor presentations before tomorrow morning, because I have access to the Commission's medical database, and I should have pulled that file when the manifest came in with the gap. If there's a standard treatment protocol, I'll have the bay stocked for it. You don't have to use it, but it'll be there." She looked at me for a long moment, then she looked back at the window. She said, "You understand that I am asking you to do nothing. I am simply having a conversation with the medical liaison." I said I understood that. She said, "And yet." I said, "And yet." That was the second day. The third day I found the file. The Orvin Medical Database, which the Commission maintains access to for multi-species events, had a clinical entry on hereditary tremor in their species. They call it the velith, a neutral anatomical term, the kind of word medicine uses before culture gets hold of it and turns it into something else. The treatment protocols were well established. Oral compound, twice daily, suppressed the intrinsic muscle activation that caused the tremor in roughly 80% of cases. Side effects minor and reversible, available in 3 formulations compatible with different Orvin metabolic profiles. The compound was not exotic. We had the base components in the station bay. I'd have to synthesize the specific formulation, which I'd done with more complicated compounds in worse-equipped facilities. But it was a 2-hour job, not a 5-day one. I synthesized it that morning. I put it in a standard medical packet, unlabeled except for a slip of paper inside that gave the dosage instructions in Orvin script, because the translation function on the Commission's printer was good enough for standard medical language. I did not put her name on it. I put it in an envelope, and I sealed the envelope, and I put it in my jacket pocket, and I went about my day. The third day was the most politically dense of the summit so far. The resource zone assessment had produced a preliminary finding that none of the 3 delegations had entirely expected, and the mood in the common areas was the particular kind of charged that comes when people are recalibrating positions they'd been confident about. I managed 2 minor incidents, a Tharvan delegate with altitude sickness who recovered quickly, and a Pelosi observer who'd eaten something from the station canteen that turned out to be cross-contaminated with a compound their digestive system doesn't process well, which required an hour in the bay and left her uncomfortable but not in danger. I was busy, which was fine. I didn't look for her. In the late afternoon, between the second plenary session and the dinner period, I passed through the east corridor doing a final monitor check, and she was there, standing at the corridor window, alone. The junior attaché was visible further down the hall, far enough to be out of earshot. I stopped beside her at the window. I took the envelope from my jacket pocket and set it on the narrow window ledge between us without looking at her. I said, "It's in the medical log under a reference number, not a name. If you want, I can walk you through the dosing. If you don't, this conversation didn't happen." She looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. She said, "Why?" I thought about several answers and discarded all of them for the simple one. I said, "Because you've been managing something for a long time that doesn't have to be managed alone. And because it's my job to stock the bay for what people need, and I was doing it badly if I hadn't stocked it already." She was quiet. I said, "There's no verdict attached to it. It's just a compound that does a thing in a system that needs it done. That's all." She picked up the envelope. She held it with both hands, and the tremor was there in the small movements of her fingers, and she looked at it for a moment with an expression I didn't entirely have a name for. Then she put it in the pocket of her robe. She said very quietly, 6 years. I have been Empress for 6 years, and I have not once been spoken to the way you spoke to me last night." I said, "That seems like a policy error at the court level." Something moved across her face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the territory adjacent to one. She said, "That is one description." She went back to her corridor. I went back to my monitors. That evening was the working dinner. The long table, all 3 delegations, the commission chairs, the support staff seated in a secondary ring around the perimeter. Formal arrangement, assigned seating, the kind of dinner that isn't really dinner so much as a structured opportunity for the principals to take each other's measure over food. I sat at the outer ring near the medical station alcove, close enough to respond to anything that needed responding to. Vasareth opened the dinner with the standard Orvan address, a statement of intention and goodwill in their ritual form, which I've heard versions of twice before and which always sounds like a formal piece of music even in translation. He introduced the delegation. Senior attaches first, then negotiators, then technical staff. When he got to the end of the list he said, without inflection, "And Observer Saravel, our secondary cultural representative," and sat down. She was seated at the far end of the Orvan section, 2 positions from the last chair. She did not look up when her name was used. The junior attaché beside her looked at his food. Across the table, the Tharvan senior attaché made a note on his tablet in the way that means he's filed something for later consideration. The commission chair moved on to the Tharvan introductions. I sat in the outer ring with my water glass, and I felt the thing I always feel when I've watched a wrong go officially unaddressed. A flatness in the chest, not anger exactly, something more like a closed circuit, energy with nowhere to discharge. I know that feeling. I've sat beside a lot of patients, while the official record described something different from what I was watching, and I've learned that there are situations where the right intervention is a careful one, and situations where it isn't, and the difference between them requires judgment. 11 years of field medicine teaches you that the situations where you stay quiet, because it's the careful thing, are different from the situations where you stay quiet because you're afraid. I was not afraid. The commission chair was wrapping up the introductions. He made a small joke about the altitude and the food, the kind of transitional pleasantry that signals the formal part is done and the meal can begin. I said, clearly and without raising my voice, but with enough volume to carry in the dinner room acoustics, "Empress Saravel." The room stopped. Not all at once, it happened in a wave, the way sound stops in a space when something interrupts the frequency. The commission chair looked up. The Tharvan senior attaché looked up. The Pelosi observers who'd been passing their token held it. Vasareth's expression did not change, which is a kind of change in itself. She looked up. Her amber eyes found me across the table and across the outer ring and across the dozen people sitting between us, and I held her gaze and I said it again, quietly and clearly and completely. Empress Saravel of the Orvan sovereignty. That's who's at this table. Vasareth said my name, Osul, in a tone that was a diplomatic attempt at correction. I said, I'm the medical liaison. I'm responsible for accurate identification of all delegation members for medical record purposes. The manifest I was given listed a secondary observer. I'm correcting the record. It was a thin argument, we both knew it. But it was argument enough to stand on, which was all I needed. The room was very quiet. The commission chair was looking at Vasareth with the expression of someone who has just had a variable introduced into his calculations that he hadn't accounted for. The Tharvan senior attaché was looking at her. The Pelosi observers were looking at each other. She was still looking at me. I don't know exactly what was in her face in that moment. I've thought about it since, more than is probably useful. The amber eyes with their horizontal pupils are designed for a different kind of reading than I'm built for. My face reading is calibrated for human and Pelosi expression, and Orvan effect shows differently. But I know what I saw because it was not complicated underneath. It was the look of someone who has spent a very long time waiting for a room to see them, and a room just did. Vasareth said, carefully, that the matter of titles was a question of diplomatic protocol that had been determined by the Orvan delegation in consultation with the commission chair prior to the summit. The commission chair, a career diplomat named Suresh, who I have always found careful and decent, looked at him for a moment, then looked at her, then said, "We may want to revisit that determination in the spirit of accurate representation." He looked at her directly when he said it. Then he said, "Empress Saravel, I apologize for the inadequate introduction. Welcome to Cathara Station." It's a small thing, probably. In the scale of galactic diplomacy, a correct introduction at a dinner table is a footnote. But I watched her receive it, the small straightening in her posture, the way she set the water glass down with both hands and the tremor and didn't hide either one. And I thought that some things are not small in the moment they happen, even if they get small later in the accounting. She said, "Thank you, Commissioner." And that was that, and the dinner continued, and I went back to my water glass, and Vasareth spent the next 40 minutes in a controlled low boil of diplomatic displeasure that he managed very professionally, and that I chose not to feel bad about. The rest of the summit ran differently after that. Not dramatically. It wasn't a reversal or a transformation in the formal sense. The resource zone negotiations continued on their track. The three delegations still had their positions and their interests and their carefully maintained distances. But the geometry shifted. The commission chair began routing questions to her directly when they touched on Orvan sovereignty matters, which they did several times in the final week. The Tharvan senior attaché, who turned out to be the kind of person I've always liked, direct, no performance, started requesting her input on resource-sharing frameworks because her thinking, freed from the pretense of the secondary observer role, turned out to be precise and original in ways that the summit hadn't been accounting for. Even the Pelosi observers, who take their social reading seriously, adjusted their token passing to include her in the consensus loop. She was good at this. I want to be clear about that, because the story isn't about me discovering that she was good at it. It's about the room finally seeing what she'd been doing quietly all along. The notes in the small bound journal, the questions she'd been routing through the junior attaché in the early sessions, letting him voice them, watching what they produced. 6 years of ruling and managing and navigating a court that used a word for her hands that meant she couldn't hold anything. By the 5th day, she was seated in the second row on the Orvan side, not moved there officially, not announced, just moved. The junior attaché had shifted back a row, and she had come forward one, and the geometry had quietly reorganized itself around the fact of her. Vasareth, to his credit, did not try to move her back. He was a man who had served long enough to know when the calculation had changed, and the calculation had changed. On the 6th day, I watched her answer a direct question from the Tharvan senior attaché, a tall, gray-scaled figure named Res Samarat who was meticulous about sourcing his observations and had clearly done his reading on Orvan sovereignty law overnight. And I watched the room register that what she said was not what the attaches had been saying. It wasn't contrary to them. It was more precise. She described the resource extraction limits as they applied to the outer sovereignty zones in language that was tighter and more technically specific than anything the summit had heard from the Orvan side in 5 days. And when she finished, there was a pause in the room, not the diplomatic silence that means people are being careful, but the different kind, the one that means people are recalculating. Res Samarat wrote for a long time on his tablet. The commission chair looked at Va Sarath with the specific expression of someone rethinking a position they'd had for several days. The journal, I realized then, had not been note-taking, or it had been that, but it had been more than that. She'd been preparing. Through all the sessions she'd been told not to speak in, she'd been reading the room and refining her positions, and the silence had given her a vantage point that the speaking participants didn't have. You learn things about a negotiation when you're invisible in it. You see which arguments land and which don't, where the hesitations are, what the other parties are actually worried about under the positions they've been instructed to hold. She had used 3 days of enforced invisibility, the way a good diagnostician uses a long, quiet observation period before intervention, to understand the system before acting on it. I kept out of her way during the days. The medical liaison is not a participant in resource zone negotiations, and I had my own work to do. I saw her in the sessions, at the dinners, twice in the corridor when we nodded at each other with the particular nod that means we're both busy and don't need to make it more than it is. She didn't come to the medical bay. She didn't need to. The compound was straightforward, self-administering, the instructions clear. I didn't look for signs of it in her hands during the sessions. That was her business, not mine. On the 9th day, the station's weather closed in hard. The plateau kind of weather that shuts down the exterior decks and turns the common areas gray and loud with wind pressure against the observation glass. The afternoon session was postponed for 2 hours when a power transfer from the station's secondary grid caused the ventilation system to briefly lose pressure in the east wing, which set off 3 separate environmental alarms simultaneously and required me to do a full bay check and individual follow-ups with any delegation members who'd been in that corridor. 30 minutes of fast work, everyone fine, 2 minor ear pressure complaints managed without incident. By the time I'd cleared the last of it and the session had finally started and finished, and the common areas had emptied out, the evening was well advanced, and the wind was doing something significant to the observation windows on the north face. I was in the corridor near the common hall with my monitor tablet when I heard her voice. She was around the corner, in the small alcove between the corridor junction and the east security door, the one with 2 chairs and a narrow table that the Orvan security staff used for handoff briefings. She was speaking, quietly, in Orvan. I couldn't understand it. My Orvan runs to basic protocol phrases and medical terminology, and what she was saying was neither. But the cadence of it was something I recognized from the diplomatic sessions. Not conversation, something more structured, more deliberate. I didn't go around the corner. I stood at the corridor junction with my tablet and I listened to the cadence, and after a moment I understood what I was hearing. She was dictating. Into a recorder, probably, or into the journal's audio function if it had one. The tone was precise and even, the pace measured, pausing at intervals for, I guessed, her own notation marks. She was filing a record of something. The sessions, possibly. The agreements in progress. Something she wanted locked in her own words before memory softened the edges. I thought about walking past. I thought about taking a different route. Then I thought that she'd already seen me in the corridor enough times to know I had legitimate reasons to be in all of them, and I went around the corner with my tablet in hand doing what I'd been doing, and she looked up briefly and I nodded and kept walking, and she went back to her dictation without changing her cadence, and that was enough. That was the 9th day. On the 10th and 11th I saw her in sessions and at the evening meals and once in the corridor again, and the nods were getting shorter, not less friendly, more efficient. The nod of people who have sorted out their understanding of each other and no longer need to renegotiate it every time they're in the same hallway. On the 12th day, the secondary resource-sharing framework was tabled for working group review, and she was assigned to the working group formally, by name, in her correct capacity. And I watched Vasareth sign the assignment without a visible reaction, and I thought, whatever conversation happened in the East Corridor between days 3 and 5, it had done its work. On the 13th day, which was the quiet day between working group sessions, she came and sat at the observation window in the common hall in the late afternoon with the small bound journal, and I happened to be finishing my supply requisition at the nearby table, and we sat in the same comfortable radius of the window for almost an hour without speaking, and that was fine. But on the 14th day, 5 days before the summit's end, she appeared at the medical bay door in the late evening. The bay was quiet. I was updating the supply logs. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have a few minutes?" It wasn't a question. I set down the tablet and gestured at the chair across from the desk. She sat. I sat. She put both hands flat on the desk between us. The tremor was there in the fine muscles, the familiar fine rhythm. Then she said, watching her hands, "It's been 12 days. I waited." She said, "It is. I noticed that it is less, not gone, but less." She looked up. "I don't know if it will be less permanently." I said, "Probably not gone permanently. The research on heritable presentations is mixed on long-term suppression. But manageable is different from gone. Manageable is enough." She considered that. She said, "My mother had it, my mother's mother. It is in the line, the females of our line, or most of them, or enough of them that the court noticed it." She said it in the same worn smooth way she'd said voided on the second night, a thing recited many times. My mother was not empress. My grandmother was not empress. The line passes, but the secondary line holds the throne. There was a time before the voiding doctrine became formal when it was different. One of my ancestors, 4 or 5 generations back, is recorded as having held it. She ruled for 31 years. A pause. The historians have her listed in the secondary notes. The main history covers her brother's regency. I said, "That's a long time to get things wrong." She said, "Cultures are not quick." I said, "No." She looked at her hands for a while. The fine rhythm was there in the fingertips. She watched it the way I've watched a lot of people watch their own conditions, not with distress, not anymore, but with a kind of old familiarity, the way you look at something you've lived alongside for so long it's become neutral. She said, "When I was 17, the court physicians presented a full assessment to my mother's Regency Council. They had protocols even then, not the same compound, something cruder, less effective. The side effect profile was significant enough that the council could argue it in either direction." A pause. They argued it in the direction that suited the doctrine. They used language about systemic disruption and uncertain long-term profile, and they filed the assessment in the secondary record, and that was the last time anyone in my court proposed a medical intervention. She looked up. "You are the first person since then to say the word treatment in connection with my hands." I thought about 17. I thought about a council deciding a girl's condition was more useful as a political fact than as a medical one. I thought about 31 years in the secondary notes. I said, "I'm sorry that took 11 years." She said very quietly, 12, I am 29. I sat with that. She said, "It is not your fault." I said, "No, but I'm sorry anyway." She was quiet. The station hummed. Somewhere in the ventilation above the bay, the ductwork was contracting in the evening cold, a low tick-tick-tick that had been there every night and that I'd stopped noticing sometime around day 4. Then she said, I want to ask you something and I want an honest answer. I said I'd try. She said, when you said my name in the dinner room, when you said my title, she lifted her eyes. Was that about me? Or was that about you, about a thing that needed correcting and I happened to be the thing? I sat with that question. It deserved the time. I said both. The wrong was in the room and I could correct it and I did. Yes, that's part of it. A medic doesn't leave a wrong unaddressed because addressing it is inconvenient. I paused. But it was about you. Because I'd listened to you talk about 11 months without your title, and I'd watched you route your questions through a junior attaché so nobody had to acknowledge you were the one asking. And I'd watched you hold your pen and write in that journal every day, and I thought someone should just say it. Just put the name in the room. It costs nothing. It's the simplest possible thing. I looked at her. It was about you. Her amber eyes held mine for a long moment. The horizontal pupils didn't convey expression the way round ones do. The affect reading requires more than the eyes. It's the whole face, the angle of the head, the way the muscles move around the jaw. But I've said that I know what I saw in her face in the dinner room, and I know what I saw now. Something settling. Something that had been held at tension for a long time and was, for the moment, at rest. She said quietly, "No one has said my name the way you said it. In 6 years of ruling. The court says it correctly, the protocol is correct. But there is a way of saying a name that means you see the person wearing it. I had forgotten that existed." I didn't have an answer for that. Some things don't need one. She said, "I'm going to tell you something that is not authorized for outside parties to know, and I'm telling you because I think you'll handle it appropriately, and because I want at least one person here to know it plainly." I said, "All right." She said, "The reason Vassarath agreed to the secondary observer arrangement was not only about the power dynamics of the negotiation. It was also partly a test. The resource zone decision will affect my sovereignty's holdings for at minimum 3 decades. He wanted to observe the other delegations without them adjusting their behavior to the presence of a sovereign. He wanted to see them as they are." A small pause. "And he wanted to see me as I am, away from the court, in a room full of people who have no interest in the voiding question and no stake in it. He has been loyal for many years, but he has his doubts. The doctrine is it is very old, very established. He wanted to see what the outside world saw when it looked at me without the protocol framing it." I said, "And what did the outside world see?" She said, "I think that's a question you might be better positioned to answer than I am." I said, "A person who adapted to a difficulty and got on with the work. That's what I saw." She was quiet. I said, "I also saw someone who was being made to be invisible and was choosing not to let that be the whole story of her, which is harder than the adaptation." Her jaw moved slightly, a small adjustment of the muscles I'd learned to read. She said, "You are a strange medical liaison." I said, "Probably." She said, "I'm glad the manifest had a gap." I said I was too. We sat for a while in the quiet of the medical bay, the station's hum underneath everything, the altitude pressing in around the walls. It was late. The last briefing had been over for 2 hours. There was nothing urgent. There was nowhere either of us needed to be. She said, "The compound. The medical log entry you mentioned, the reference number, not the name." I said yes. She said, "When the summit closes and the records are filed, can it be corrected, the name on the entry?" I said, "I can file an amendment to the medical record under your correct title. It goes into the Commission's permanent archive." I paused. "That's a public record. Any party can access it." She said, "I know." I said, "Your court will see it." She said, "I know that too." I thought about what she was asking and what she was not asking. I thought about Vassarath and his test, and his decades of loyal service, and his old doubts about a doctrine that had been in place since before he was born. I thought about 31 years, and secondary notes, and the main history that covered her brother's regency. I thought about the small bound journal and the careful writing and the questions rooted through the junior attaché. I said, "I'll file the amendment on the last day, under your full name and title, for the permanent record." She nodded, then she said, "Thank you, Corvin Osel." She said my name the way she'd asked me to say hers, both of them. Like they meant something together. I didn't have a good answer for that either. I nodded back. She stood to leave. She was almost at the door when she stopped and turned and looked at me for a moment. She said, "You asked, the second night, how long it had been since someone used my title." I said I remembered. She said, "I want you to know that I have thought of an earlier instance. There was a child, the daughter of one of my household staff, 7 years old when I took the throne. Her mother brought her to the formal reception, which the staff families attend. And the child came through the line and stopped in front of me and looked up and said, 'You're the real queen, aren't you?' with the particular certainty small children have for things adults have decided to be complicated." She paused. "I have thought about that child many times." I said, "That counts." She said, "I think so too." She left. On the 19th day, the closing session, the Resource Zone Agreement was signed by all 3 delegations with the Commission as witness. The Tharvan senior attaché, in the formal remarks, noted the clarifying contributions of the Orvan sovereign to the secondary resource-sharing framework, which was the diplomatic way of saying her thinking had shaped the best section of the agreement. Vas Sarath, standing beside her at the signing table, did not show anything that could be called expression. But he stood close, and when she signed, he held the document steady for her with both hands without being asked, and she received that quietly. And I thought that was probably a conversation that had happened somewhere in the East Corridor over the previous 2 weeks, conducted in the private language of people who have known each other long enough to do it without words. I stood at the back of the signing chamber and filed the medical record amendment on my tablet, under her full name and title, with the reference date of first contact and the treatment notation and the words, "Condition manageable, outcome positive, patient in good health." I sent it to the Commission archive and got the confirmation ping and put the tablet away. The delegations broke for a final informal gathering, drinks, no agenda, the kind of loose hour that ends a long summit. I did my final rounds, signed off the environmental units, submitted the bay inventory. The transport was scheduled for the following morning. I was doing the last of the exterior monitor checks on the west side of the station, the side that faces away from the glacier shelf and out over the plateau's long drop into the lower valleys, when I heard steps behind me on the observation deck. The sun was going down, not bronze like the first morning, but red and wide, the whole sky doing something extraordinary over the valley, the kind of end of day that high altitude produces when the conditions are right and you're standing in the right place. She came out onto the deck and stood beside me. We didn't say anything for a while. The wind was down for the first time in days. It had been a constant companion at Cathara, always present, always pushing at the collar and the ears, and its absence made the evening feel heavier in a way that wasn't bad. Just present. She said after a time, "I looked up the file, the Commission archive." I said, "It went through this afternoon." She said, "Yes." A pause. "Empress Saravel of the Orvan sovereignty. Correct title, correct designation, in the permanent record." I said, "That's right." She was quiet for a while longer. The valley was going purple and gold in the last of the light. A long, slow color change that happened while we stood there without either of us marking the moment it shifted. Then she reached across the railing, not far, just the small distance between us, and she placed her hand over mine where it rested on the deck rail. Both of her hands, covering one of mine, the fine tremor moving through her fingers and into the back of my hand like something transmitted, like a frequency. She held it there. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. I thought about 11 months and a 7-year-old who knew a real queen when she saw one. I thought about the word manageable and the word voided and the distance between them. I thought about a file in a permanent archive, with a name in it that would be there after both of us were gone, in the record, under the correct title, unambiguous. I turned my hand over under hers slowly and held on. The wind stayed down. The valley kept going purple and gold. She said very quietly after a long time, "I won't forget this place." I said, "Neither will I." We stood there until the light was gone and the station's exterior panels came up, and the first stars appeared over the plateau's edge, sharp and cold and very close at altitude, the way they always are when there's nothing between you and the sky. I thought she would go in then, but she stayed, and I stayed. And the stars got more of the sky the longer we stood there, until the valley below was dark and the plateau was lit only by the panels and the sky was full. Neither of us made a promise. Neither of us needed to. She was going back to her sovereignty and her court and the long work of a doctrine being slowly wrong in ways that take generations to right, and I was going back to my logistics job and my commission desk and my shoulder that predicts weather. These were not things that fit neatly together. We both understood that. There's a particular kind of understanding between people who have been honest with each other in a compressed time. 19 days is not long. But summits don't run on ordinary time. They run on summit time, which is compressed in high altitude and stripped of the usual insulation of routine. You see people more clearly at Kethara than you would in a year of ordinary proximity. The light does it. The cold. The wind that never stops until it suddenly does. I've been to 7 of these, and I've watched people form connections in 3 weeks that most ordinary relationships don't form in years. And I've watched some of them survive transit back to the ordinary world and some of them not. And I've never been certain which outcome depends on the connection and which depends on the people. What I know is that what happened here was real. The record says so. The permanent archive says so. And she had stood beside me with her trembling hand over mine on the rail, and the stars coming in over the plateau, and I had held on. She spoke once more before she finally went in. She said, "What will you do with the medical referral for the formal follow-up?" I said I'd route it through the Commission's multi-species health coordination channel. There was a specialist in Orvan neurology at one of the regional facilities. I'd found the name in the database when I was looking up the compound. I'd send the file with the correct name on it and a note recommending follow-up assessment for the longer-term treatment options. Whether she followed up was her decision. The file would be there. She said, "You are very thorough." I said, "Occupational habit." She said, "No." She looked at the stars for a moment. "It is not habit. A habit is a thing you do without deciding. You decide. I have watched you for 19 days and you decide each thing. The manifest gap, the compound, the dinner, the amendment, each one was a decision." She paused. "I have been surrounded for 6 years by people who manage me, who calculate the cost of what I am and make arrangements for it. You are the first person I have encountered who simply addressed the situation. Without the calculation." She looked at me. "I don't know what that is if it isn't something more deliberate than habit." I thought about that. The stars were very bright above the plateau, the kind of bright you get at altitude when there's no weather and nothing to scatter the light. I could see the glacier shelf as a pale shape to the east even in the dark, the same shelf that had been throwing bronze light through the windows on the first morning. I said, "I think it might just be what medicine trains you toward. You see what's there and you deal with what's there. You don't deal with a cultural interpretation of a nerve condition. You deal with the nerve condition. You don't introduce yourself to a secondary cultural observer. You introduce yourself to whoever is actually standing in front of you." I paused. "Which is you? Which was always you?" She held my gaze for a long time. She said, "Yes." And then the silence again, comfortable, the stars overhead, the valley dark, the panels making their faint exterior hum. Her hand still over mine on the rail and the tremor moving through it and me holding on. But her hand was over mine on the rail, and the tremor was there, and I held it anyway, and the word manageable hung in the air between us like a thing that had always been true and was now official. When she finally went in, she stopped at the door and looked back once, and I looked back, and that was all. The next morning I was at the transport bay at first light finishing the last of the equipment manifest. The Orving delegation loaded in their correct order, advanced staff first, then the rest. She came through the door fourth, the way she had on arrival, the same careful balance, the same copper-dark hair catching what light there was. She stopped when she passed me. She said, "The amendment, Corvan." I said, "It's there, it'll stay there." She nodded. She looked at me for one long moment, and I looked back, and in the amber eyes with the horizontal pupils I read what I'd learned to read in them: settled, at rest, seen. She went up the ramp. I filed the final equipment manifest and drank the last of the terrible coffee from the station's service unit, and stood in the cold transport bay while the ships ran their departure sequences. And I thought about how some things are very small, and some things are not, and the difference is not always in the scale of them, but in the moment they happen. Her ship lifted out into the bronze morning light, the same light as the first day, hard off the glacier shelf, everything sharp, nothing blurred. I watched it until the sky took it. Then I went back inside to finish my paperwork, because the paperwork doesn't do itself, and because that is the kind of person I am, and because somewhere in a commission archive in a permanent record under the correct title and designation, there is a medical file that says, Empress Saravel of the Orving Sovereignty. Condition manageable. Outcome positive. Patient in good health. It'll be there long after the summit notes are filed, and the resource zone agreement runs its course, and the delegations have gone back to being the ordinary business of three species trying to share a difficult galaxy. It'll be there when I'm long past the transport circuit and the commission desk. A small correction in the record, a name in the right place. That's all it is. That's enough.